Hey guys, it's me, Wulf, back with another video. I needed a little pause from the Stronghold Crusader build series, so I wanted to make a video that's more on the educational side, by sharing my beginner woodworking knowledge with other beginners. And a small disclaimer up front, this first part is going to deal with the theoretical aspect of woodworking, and I'm going to build the birdhouse on the next part. Learning the theory might sound a bit dry and annoying, but in my opinion it's really important to have a basic understanding of the material and the tools you're using to properly work with them. Also, if you're already familiar with one of the topics, feel free to skip to whatever chapter you're interested in. Okay, let's get started. I got this idea from a relative who found an old destroyed birdhouse on a hiking trail and he wanted to replace it, so he came to me and said, "Hey kiddo, you wanna make a birdhouse?" And I said, nope. No, I said, "Sure, I'll make you a birdhouse." And because I still need a lot of practice with hand tools myself, I thought this is a great opportunity to take other beginner woodworkers along the journey with me. Now, if I say beginner, I really mean beginner. I've seen way too many YouTube videos where they claim to make beginner projects and then use exotic wood species, complicated wood joinery, pocket holes or biscuits and power tools like a circular saw, a router and a nail gun and whatnot. And that's just not my definition of a beginner. To me, a beginner is someone who bought some wood and basic hand tools and wants to craft something simple with their hands. Maybe as a new hobby, maybe to steer into a newer career path. Or you're like me, who has some scrap wood laying around, wants to get more into hand tool woodworking, who uses his grandpa's old tools out of nostalgia and tries to make a birdhouse. Well, that's pretty specific, but what I'm trying to say here is, to me a beginner is someone who's new to the craft, and we all start with different skill levels, different tools and different projects we want to realize, but there's one thing that all beginner and also pro woodworkers have in common: the working with wood part. To a regular person it might seem like one of the most abundant and basic materials out there, but wood has quite some intricacies to it. Okay, teacher glasses on, and here we go. Wood comes from trees. I know, even a baby knows this, but the point I'm trying to get across here is that it comes from a living organism that changes with the seasons and the weather. Some tree species like wet soil, some like it drained. Some are resistant to wind and others don't like it at all. Some need a long time to grow, others grow quickly, and some grow tall while others stay short. With all the different tree species that grow in different circumstances all around the world, there's no wonder that we have a wide range of wood types, but they are generally divided into two main categories: softwood and hardwood. With these two words, it's reasonable to assume that softwood is softer than hardwood, and that's right most of the time. It really depends on the tree species, but as a rule of thumb we can say fast-growing trees with needles like spruce, fir and pine are softwood, and slow-growing trees with leaves like maple, walnut and cherry are hardwood. There are some exceptions though. Yew, for example, has needles and is considered a softwood, but is actually really hard. Balsa trees on the other hand grow leaves and are considered a hardwood, but their wood is actually really soft. Now, to be fair, if you are a beginner like me and you see a wooden board in front of you, you probably don't know what tree species it is from, unless you bought the labeled boards from the hardware store. And in my opinion, as a beginner, it also doesn't matter that much whether you have soft or hardwood at your disposal, unless you're trying to make a really specific project. To me, the thing that really matters are that softwood is generally speaking softer, so it's easier to cut and work with, and it's a lot cheaper than hardwood. You might not be able to make the finest furniture with exotic colors and patterns, but using softwood for an outside table, a wooden planter box or in my case a birdhouse is totally fine. So just keep in mind that soft and hardwood exists, and that you should choose them according to the project you're trying to make. Now, most of us don't cut wooden boards out of trees ourselves, and especially as a beginner you're probably not doing that. We're buying already cut wooden planks, and there are a few things to look out for when buying some. But for that we have to learn a bit more about the correlation between the tree trunk and the wooden board. The first important thing to know is how growth rings affect the boards and later the finished workpiece. Small disclaimer up front again, this is mostly the case for softwoods, for hardwoods it's a little different. Let's just look at this piece of firewood here. We can see two types of alternating lines. The lighter parts form during the growth period from spring to early summer. That's where the tree grows a lot and that's why they're wider, but also not very dense and with that softer. The darker lines on the other hand form during the growth period from late summer to fall. That's where the tree slows down the growing process to try and preserve energy for the winter, and that's the reason why the lines are narrower, but also denser and with that harder. That means every pair of lines reflects the growth of a tree over a period of a year, and that's why they're called growth rings or annual rings. On this piece of firewood the term growth rings doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because this is only a part of a trunk, but on this cross section here you can see where the name comes from. Here's another example where we can guess that the center of the trunk or the pith was located somewhere around here. And after that, every year the tree grew an extra light layer and an extra dark layer. And that's really how we have to imagine a growth ring on a wooden board, because on the cross section it might be a ring, but in reality this ring is a layer that goes through the whole trunk. This here, for example, is one and the same growth ring, but because the trunk is round and the board was cut flat, it makes this pattern here. So that's what growth rings are and how they form, but why do we have to understand them? You may have heard someone say that wood is a living material, and that refers to the wood movement mostly caused by the growth rings. If the wood is gaining moisture, that could be from a liquid source or the moisture content in the air, it expands, and if it loses moisture, it contracts. This process never really stops. It can be minimized with certain techniques, but it's never disappearing completely, and you have to consider that on your projects. What makes this even more complicated is that it doesn't expand and contract evenly on every side. Now these are rounded values and they aren't the same for every wood type, but an approximate value would be 0.1% for the lengthwise expansion, and that's so minimal it can be neglected. The expansion parallel to the growth rings is to be considered in project because it's 4%, and with 8% the wood is expanding the most across the growth rings. This difference in expansion and contraction has different effects on different wooden boards, and for that we need to look into what the main types of wooden boards are. This was a little confusing to me because from what I've seen, the terminology is different for a sawyer, that's what a sawmill employee is called, and for woodworkers and carpenters. A sawyer classifies the wooden boards in the way they are cut, so plain sawn boards are cut like this, quarter sawn boards like this, and rift sawn boards like this. From a woodworker or carpenter's point of view, they are looking at the growth ring directions on the end of the board. They often differentiate between plain sawn and live sawn. Live sawn is the same as plain sawn for a sawyer, so you're getting lots of boards out of one trunk, but they all have the bark on the sides. Plain sawn for woodworkers means something like this, where we end up with some nice boards and some bad quality boards that are sometimes discarded as waste. Quarter sawn boards for a woodworker are only boards that have the growth rings running almost parallel to the edge of the board, so from 60 to 90 degrees. And rift sawn boards have the growth rings from a 30 to a 60 degree angle. So once again, from a woodworker's perspective, if a sawyer has quarter sawn boards for us, it means we're getting a few quarter sawn boards and more rift sawn boards. If he has rift sawn boards for us, we are getting only quarter sawn boards. I hope I've explained this reasonably well, and I said before, different wooden boards expand and contract differently, and the way I understood that and the way you can predict how a piece of wood will warp is as follows. Let's take this plain sawn board as an example, and let's just say this was sawn some time ago and we're letting it dry now. While losing moisture, we know that the contraction through the growth rings is the strongest. And there are all these lines around the middle here that are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. There is compression happening on this axis as well, but not enough to counteract this force, which leads to cupping of the board. On the sides the board can get a little thinner and lose half of that in width, but that doesn't affect the straightness of the board. When the wood is gaining moisture, it is bending and expanding in the opposite direction because the fibers grow and grow and grow. A rift sawn board contracts on this axis because once again this force is greater than this one. A quarter sawn board on the other hand contracts a little like this and a little more like this, and that means the board almost doesn't warp. This is the reason why the quarter sawn boards are the most expensive to buy. And one more thing, this would be easier to counteract if the growth rings were all perfectly straight throughout the trunk, but they aren't, and if we have branches in the board, then it's even funnier. Now, I hope I didn't scare you off with all that information. This can be quite confusing, but it's really useful when working with wood, and especially if you're buying it. So before buying, make sure to look at the end of the wooden board. Let's just look at a picture of a bunch of wooden planks and apply this knowledge. Here we can see different cuts. There are some plain cuts like this one and this one. If we can decide, it's better to choose the ones furthest away from the pith, because that's where the growth rings are the least predictable. This board here, for example, where the growth rings are really thin and almost horizontally parallel, is still considered plain sawn. This simply means that it was cut out of a massive tree, and these won't cup as much as these. There are quite a few rift cut boards, this one for example, or this one. And here's a really nice board where we could cut a strip away from both sides to get a nice quarter sawn board. So if you're buying a board, keep in mind how it's gonna change over time, and obviously avoid buying one that's already warped or bent. It's also advisable to grab the piece of wood with the least defects. There are quite a few, but most of them are easy to notice. Other than warping and twisting, the board can have cracks or splits. It can have resin pockets or bark pockets. Sometimes it was cut too far on the outside of the trunk and there's still some bark on there. Another defect are knots, and that's just the name for the brown spots that were branches once. These knots are considered a defect because they are harder than the other parts of the wood. They form growth rings around them that don't align with the rest of the board, and sometimes they fall out, leaving behind a big hole in the board. I know, lots of things to look out for when buying lumber, but there is one more aspect that's important when buying boards, and that is aesthetics. Because if we're talking aesthetics, a wood defect lies in the eye of the beholder after all. Some people like to fix cracks with some nice looking joinery, others say that knots and bark pockets give the wood its character. There are different wood species that have different colors, and you can play around with their combinations. Going back to the types of wooden boards we have, we can decide which side or which face is visible. On a flat sawn board we have the growth ring lines on the edge running parallel to the face, and on the face we have this so-called cathedral shape. On a rift sawn board we have growth ring lines running parallel to the front and the side. On quarter sawn boards we have the growth ring lines running parallel on the edge, and you can see the medullary rays or flecks that can create a really nice pattern. Okay, enough with that. We finally bought the wooden boards we want to work with, but we haven't talked about how to work with them. And besides the growth rings, we have another thing to look out for, and that are the wood fibers. What are they and what do they do? It may be a little weird, but I always like to imagine a tree as if it were a bunch of spaghetti, because a piece of wood is a collection of many fibers that are normally running lengthwise throughout the whole tree. I am using the term normally here because on a branch, for example, the fibers don't continue like that, they change direction with the branch. And just because they are running lengthwise through the tree doesn't mean that they are always straight like this. They can twist and turn, be wavy and irregular. On this little piece of wood here we can see the fibers really well, and what's important for woodworking here is that it's way easier to split them in parallel or lengthwise rather than perpendicular or across. If I'm using my spaghetti analogy again, you can see why it's easier to split them like this or this instead of splitting them like this. And if we're thinking about how a sawmill is cutting boards out of a trunk, it makes sense that they're cutting them lengthwise to get long boards, but the real reason is the fiber orientation that makes the boards harder to split like that. For firewood, where you want it to be easy to split, it makes sense to cut across the fibers. So that means we can use the wood fiber direction to our advantage, and this not only applies when splitting wood, but also when planing and cutting it with a saw. When cutting it we have to cut with the fibers and not against them, because like this the saw is more likely to get stuck. Same with the hand planer or a chisel. If you're using it with the grain, it's slicing through the fibers. If you're using it against the grain, it gets stuck and wants to bury itself deep inside the wood. If you're working against the grain, you're probably gonna notice it quite soon because you're creating tear out. Tear out happens when the wood fibers get ripped out instead of cut, and you're left with a rough, ugly surface. This tear out rule applies to sawing, cutting with a knife or chisel, planing, and even with sanding, even though sanding is a little more forgiving, but let's talk about that a little later. Now, because all of this isn't confusing enough, both the fiber direction and the growth ring placement throughout the board are often referred to as wood grain, and you're gonna hear that word being used a lot, and it can describe multiple things. Depending on how thick the growth rings are, the board can have narrow grain or wide grain. On a flat sawn board we have horizontal grain or flat grain, and on a quarter sawn board we have vertical grain. On the other hand, straight grain, spiral grain and wavy grain all describe the orientation of the wood fibers and not the growth rings. And this grain word even depends on which side of the board you're working on. Thus, if you're working on the surface, the edge and the end of the wooden board, you're working on the face grain, the edge grain and the end grain. So to me it seems that the usage of the word grain really depends on the context. Okay, after learning all about those things, we can say no matter what type of wood hardness, growth ring pattern, fiber direction and wood grain and whatnot, the core reason why this is important can be boiled down to two simple problems: how to prevent boards from bending and how to prevent tear out. Said like this, it really sounds easy, right? But I think we've learned enough about wood for now, so let's talk about some basic hand tools. Here are some of them, and all these items could be upgraded to something faster, more precise or easier to handle, and if you have better options or power tools, then please use them. But in my opinion, this is the bare minimum you need to start your woodworking journey. The first tool we need isn't really a tool, it's a sturdy table, because it is a real pain to use a handsaw while the table keeps rocking around with every stroke. You need at least 2 clamps to hold the workpieces in place. Holding everything with your hand while cutting is very difficult, you might get injured and it's extremely annoying. You can use these older F clamps, they're simply called that because of their shape, or more modern trigger clamps. The upgrade from the clamps is the first one I would get of all the upgrades, and it's a vise. Either a machinist vise or a woodworking bench vise, or maybe even a planing bench with dog holes and holdfasts. It makes holding a workpiece infinitely easier than clamping it onto the table. Next comes the saw, or saws in my case. You could technically only use one saw, but I prefer to have one for finer cuts and one for rougher cuts. And there are quite a few things to learn about saws as well, but I'm not trying to explain every saw type to have ever existed to you. This here is a bag saw with cross-cut teeth. The name bag saw comes from this thicker metal part up here that's keeping the saw blade rigid on the back, and to explain what cross-cut teeth are, we gotta go back to the wood fibers again real quick, because there are 2 ways you can cut a wooden board. either along or parallel to the wood fibers, which is called rip cutting, using a rip cut saw blade, or by cross cutting, using a cross cut saw blade to cut across the fibers. Makes sense, right? The difference in these saw types lies in the teeth shape on the saw blade. The rip cut saw has straight pointy teeth. They don't need a cutting edge, they just need to be pointy. You can think of them as a row of chisels that shave off the fibers bit by bit. The crosscut saw has teeth alternating from left to right that are shaped to be like two rows of knives. Now, rip and crosscut saws have their own application, but it's not impossible to use one for the other purpose. Using the spaghetti as wood fibers again, we can see that using a rip cut saw, like it's intended, obviously works, but if we're going across the fibers, it will just rip them out, causing a lot of tear out. And that's exactly the reason why the crosscut saw has these two knife-like cuts that sever the fibers into two rows, and like that they aren't ripping. Using a crosscut saw for rip cutting doesn't cause tear out, but it's just really slow. Another important part is sawing technique. There are saws that are cutting on the pull stroke, like the Japanese saws for example, the push stroke, like most European saws, or they can also cut on both strokes. The easiest way to find out what type of saw you have is to test it out on a piece of scrap wood. Once you know which stroke it cuts, it's advisable to put force into the cutting stroke and relax during the non-cutting stroke. I think one mistake beginners often make, I can say that because I did that when I started out as well, is that they're trying to push the saw down too hard. I don't know if it makes sense how I'm explaining this, but to me it always seems that 80% of your force should go into the pushing or pulling motion, depending on which stroke your saw is cutting, and 20% into pushing the saw down. When moving the saw in the non-cutting direction, you can just hold it very lightly and let it bounce. One more tiny thing about sawing and then we move on. Some saws, like this bag saw here for example, have a limit how deep they can cut. If you were to cut down with this like this, the border stops right here. With this one we can get a deeper cut, but there's a limit as well. On this Japanese saw for example, this limit doesn't exist, and theoretically speaking you could cut infinitely long. The same goes for this folding saw. So just keep that in the back of your mind, and let's continue with the other tools. I already showed you this bow saw and I'm using it for all the rougher cuts. It has big teeth that can be used on the pull and push stroke, it can rip cut and cross cut fairly well too, so it's really an all-rounder but creates a relatively rough surface. Another small comment here, I find this type of handle infinitely more comfortable than one of these handles because of the natural position of your wrist. With these you gotta stretch it forward all the time, and with these you can hold it comfortably. So if you haven't bought a saw yet, try to get one with these handles. And if you're going to a physical store and not ordering online, try out how it feels in your hand. Okay, next tool is a cutter knife. I'm using it to cut off some edges and use it as a substitute for a chisel. You could use a pocket knife instead, but then I would recommend that you learn how to properly sharpen it. I like this one because the blades are super sharp and once they're dull I can just change the blade. These cutter knives and blades are fairly cheap as well, but they are a bit wasteful though. Also, if you're buying one, try to get one like this, that's a little sturdier and has a broader blade, and not one of these. We could use the cutter as a marking knife, but I prefer a pencil, and I would highly recommend to get one version of a 90-degree angle. It could be one like this, or some type of carpenter's square. I've never gotten one of these, but they seem really handy, so I'm most likely going to buy one of these very soon. We need a measuring device as well, like this folding ruler, a metal ruler or a tape measure would work as well. The wood plane is optional, and I gotta be honest here, I struggled quite a bit planing these boards myself, so I don't feel comfortable telling you a lot about wood planing and how to do it. There are lots of videos on YouTube that explain the types of planes, how to adjust them and how to use them properly, so if you're interested in that, check those out. I am still going to tell you a bit about my struggles with this hand plane though. One important message up front: the easiest way to get a flat piece of wood with a smooth surface is to buy them, but we've already went through the whole wood movement story, so that's not always an option. I'm using an old pallet and the boards here are rough and irregular. On the ends they often have this chamfer and I could technically cut a strip off with a saw, but it's easier to just plane it down. Another problem I had was that the pallet was painted and I could sand away all of it, but that would take forever. Here is where I cheated a little and used the vise to hold the wooden boards in place, because planing all of them took long enough, and to do this with the clamps, that would have just robbed me of the little sanity I have left. If you have to plane the board yourself and have no other option than to clamp the workpiece onto a table, I would suggest to do it on a table where you can reach it from both sides, or have it facing the wall on one side and putting a clamp on the other. This plane I'm using is a pretty cheap one. I think it's about 26 euros, something like that, but it does the job. And if you have to do some hand planing yourself, then you gotta think about the wood grain again, because I'm still having trouble with that as well. I'm making shallow cuts and simply look if it's staring out. And here I have one example as to why this wasn't really easy. If we're cutting in this direction, it gets stuck here, but works fine over here. If we are planing in the other direction, it gets stuck here, but works here. So the correct way of planing this would be to imagine a line through here and plane in opposite directions. Now here we go in this direction, right, but here's a branch and you can see that here I got some tear out again. So we gotta do it like this, I guess. On the top side of the board, this direction works all the way through and doesn't collide with this direction because they're the same. But down here we gotta imagine a line again and plane in opposite directions. This time the planing direction isn't the same as this one, so at which point do we change the direction? As you can see, it's really not that fun, and with this poorly adjusted plane and my poorly adjusted skills, I just wasn't able to plane every board correctly. What lacking skills in cutting and planing cause has to be fixed with some sandpaper. I'm using 100 grit sandpaper. That means that on 1 square inch there are 100 little abrasive particles. I'm using the 100 grit because it's a good all-rounder. For reference, a very coarse option would be 40 grit and a fine option would be 400 grit. From what I've heard though, most woodworkers say that you don't need to go above 220 grit unless you're using lacquer or epoxy resin and want to sand that very smooth. And there's another comparison: when sharpening a knife you can go from 100 for the rough sharpening to 400 to 1000 and as far as 16,000 grit. When using sandpaper on a wooden board, we have to once again think about the grain direction. It's not as complicated as planing though, because as long as you're going with the grain direction, the surface will turn out smooth. Think about the abrasive particles as tiny chisels again that slowly shave down the wood fibers. If you're going across the grain, it causes small tear out on the wood fibers. And one more tiny thing, we've learned that the lighter color parts of the growth rings are softer. And that means they get sanded down faster than the harder, dark lines. One tip that helps to avoid that is to use a sanding block. That could also just be a piece of scrap wood where you wrap some sandpaper around. Just make sure that it's a flat piece of scrap wood. And if you're sanding with your hand, try to use the sandpaper like this and not like this. I've learned this on a summer job at 15 while working at a car body mechanic shop, when I had to hand sand lots of bumpers and fenders. The problem here is the gap between the fingers that becomes visible after some time, but like this we don't have that problem. Okay, we're done with the sandpaper, and last but not least is the fastening method. I decided to use a hammer and nails. My reason behind that is that if you were to use screws, the boards would almost certainly split unless you're pre-drilling every hole. And that means we either need a power drill, or maybe you even have one of these good old-fashioned hand drills. The problem with this one though is that you need 2 hands to operate it, and that could get tricky sometimes. The problem on mine in particular is that the jaws aren't closing enough for the tiny drill I would have to use. With these nails though, I don't need to pre-drill the holes, and nails have another advantage: they can bend. Now, that sounds like a disadvantage at first, but it's actually helping here, because as we know by now, wood is moving, and with nails the wood is less likely to split even if it expands and contracts. Also, I have lots of nails that I'm never using, and they are really cheap. Okay, I think I've never talked this much in a video without building anything, and I guess that's it for the first part. I hope I was able to give you a basic insight into woodworking and some things to look out for when starting your own woodworking journey. If you're interested in how I built a simple birdhouse with the simple hand tools listed above, then make sure to watch part 2 of this series. And as always, thanks for watching.